I'm going to show you 9 tips for shooting in virtual production. Number 1, use a controller. Now, it doesn't have to be a game controller, although it can be, but often what you see on kind of larger projects and shoots is these big panels, lots of buttons, and the benefit of that is that every button has a function, rather than having to dig into menus, find where the mouse is, and like do little sliders and things like that. Having knobs and buttons and things that control values that you change a lot of the time, whether it's be to like film a take or adjust a key or whatever it may be. There's a lot of value in being able to actually just press the button and do the thing at the time of need, rather than having to dig into that thing. So it doesn't have, you have to go big on it. You don't have to invest in all these crazy controllers and things, but something like a Stream Deck or using something like Touch OSC to make custom like control boards, even game controllers work as well. Gives you a lot of flexibility and access to the parameters that you need at the time. Tip number 2. Add value to your setup for the people you're working with. So you are probably the person that's like set things up, maybe you're working the gallery, or maybe you're operating the camera as well. When you're working on a slightly bigger shoot, and ultimately you're probably going to be shooting people, you need to think about what they're doing. What's the value that they're getting from your setup? What can you do with virtual production that you couldn't do otherwise? So, for instance, having like a TV in the corner with the final pixel result that everyone can see and everyone has reference to is a huge value to virtual production that you don't have in other forms of VFX. Same goes for like directors, camera people. Like setting the things up and working to the needs that they have is going to get a better result in the long term. Allowing them to like work within the constraints, understand what the constraints are, and then give them the best value for what they want to do is how you will succeed. My next tip kind of ties into that, and it's almost the opposite, is don't overcomplicate the functionality of your studio or your setup. It can be very tempting to kind of add features, add ideas, add lots of like things and elements to your shoots that should make life easier or improve the overall result. But if they're not useful things that you end up using, they're just getting in the way of the end result in the final instance. So an example of this is that I set up loads of like control panels and buttons for people. Ultimately, I wasn't the person actually operating the gallery. It was someone else. And their idea of value was very different to what perhaps I thought they might get from it. So ask lots of questions, work with people, understand what they are getting from the experience that you're trying to create in terms of like a shoot environment, and work towards that. My next tip. Separate out devices and have dedicated hardware. Now, this might seem contrary to the kind of overcomplicating thing or not wanting to overcomplicate things, but what happens a lot, or what I found at least, was that I was relying on the computer to do a lot of the work in virtual production. It was rendering the scene, obviously, it was doing the compositing, and it was also recording a video, as well as running some other server stuff as well to make everything work. And that was quite taxing on the machine. Like even a high-end machine, there's going to be limits, and that limit is real-time virtual production. You can only up the quality so far before you start dropping frames. So you have to make allowances for that. Now, one of the biggest changes we made was offloading the recording to a separate device and using hyperdeck recorders rather than encoding it on a computer. The benefit of that was, if we want to record multiple streams, which we do, we have a final pixel and then we have the 3 input cameras that we might want to comp later, we can just keep adding hyperdecks. If we want to add more cameras, we just need another deck, and they can all be triggered remotely at the same time, and they all have the same time code. Something that the computer is really struggling to do, encoding video as well as rendering the final result and compositing at the same time. My next tip, always be developing and always be testing. So something you should have in mind is that the setup that you have is probably going to be quite custom. It's probably going to involve some elements that no one else has. And there's a real benefit in that, because you can work on the devices and the setup or the arrangement of hardware that allows you to progress and allows you to develop and allows your studio to develop. But you have to test it, because if you introduce something new into a shoot scenario and you haven't tested it and you rely on it, things can go wrong very quickly. Next tip, it'll never be perfect, but you should strive for perfection. Now, they might sound contrary, but what I'm trying to get at here is that you can keep adding hardware, you can keep adding features. You'll never get to that perfection, but you should learn what you've got. There's always the kind of shiny object syndrome of this possible other solution that's out there, this new tracking system that's supposedly better, or this person on YouTube had a better result with it, so I'll use that instead. The truth is, everyone has a very unique use case, and you've got to practice with the kit you have. And you don't need a lot. Yes, like you can get better cameras, you can get better tracking systems, you can get better lens encoders, But the truth is, you don't need a lot these days. Like, moving on from maybe a few years ago, you could start out with some really simple stuff, like a phone, like a game system. Like, people were working with like what they had basically, and you can still do that. That stuff still exists. It takes a bit more work and development, but you can get up and running without having to spend a lot of money. And that's what I'm getting at, is you don't have to keep spending money. Get the value out of what you've got and learn it. This flows nicely into my next tip. It doesn't have to be expensive. Your setup doesn't have to be expensive. It's all about the result that you get at the end of the day. So there will always be new hardware, there will always be new ideas, there will always be new tutorials and new things to do, but you have to decide where the value lies for you. What are you getting out of your hardware? What's the end result? What are your audience saying? Do they care it's filmed in virtual production? Does the storytelling support it? Think about your audience and what they want to get out of the experience of watching your content. Now for my final tip, and probably the most important tip that I can think of: engage with the community around your craft. That applies to anything, but it especially applies to virtual production, I've found. There's so many things that I've learned along the way. I only got into this maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, but I would not have learned anything if it weren't for the amazing people putting up tutorials, answering my forum posts, and being able to have that open conversation about things that you're trying to learn and trying to achieve. It's a very inclusive community, or at least I've found that. So don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions in the comments of videos, reach out on forums. For me, like, YouTube has been the best way to be able to see what people are doing and then reach out to people directly. I use Oximetry, that's kind of one of the softwares that we use, and the Oximetry forums are like quite a niche place to be able to go and like chat to people who know exactly what's going on. A lot of times there's not much documentation, and that especially wasn't 3 years ago. So being able to go and ask people and get people's opinions on what we could be doing or should be doing, or what the hardware could do or should do or isn't doing, was really, really valuable for me to progress, and you should too. So if you have any questions, get on the forums, talk to me in the comments, reach out, and I'll be more than happy to answer any and all questions and get involved. See you on the next one.